All right, before we kick off this next panel on democracy and technology, we're going to ask the audience's opinion of that topic. If you want to whip out your Web Summit app and pull out Slido Q&A, go to the forum. We've got a question to ask all of you, a poll. Is technology good or bad for democracy? So get on the app, give us your opinion, and we'll find out more about that. So big tech has concentrated more wealth in fewer hands, but it's also given the power of voice to the people. Grassroots movements can bring social change. They can also be hijacked by angry mobs. So how do we change minds for social good? And who decides what's good? Please welcome to the stage Matt Steinglass from The Economist and founder of the world's largest social change platform, Matt Rattray.
Hi, thanks for coming. I understand that you guys are getting the opportunity to vote on Slido to say what you think the impact of technology on democracy has been, and whether you think technology is good for a democracy or bad for democracy. So if as many of you as possible could vote on that, it would be great. I would love to get a sense of what the room thinks about this. Ben and I were talking earlier about what the impact of technology and democracy has been, and we were noting that there's a whole discourse of a series of horrible things that have happened to democracy because of technology. And we thought it might be nice to sort of get that discourse out of the way first, and then we can talk about some of the good things that are happening. But, for example, the problem of polarization. Technology has been bad for this, yes?
I think unequivocally so. I mean, I think that, look, the reality is democracy has been impacted in both substantially negative ways and I think has huge opportunities for dramatic improvement because of technology. But the reality is to be able to most effectively leverage the available technologies for the most amount of good, we have to just be honest with ourselves of the challenges that we face, and it is substantial. Like, it is shocking to see the perverse impact that polarization, misinformation, sensationalism has had, not just on individual citizens, but also on democracies around the world.
Mm-hmm. And so those are discrete issues, right? There's the issue of increasing polarization. There's the issue of people sorting themselves into like-minded communities, and then there's the issue of unreliability, fake media. Is there anything we can say about that beyond technology has helped us along?
I think let's just take them maybe piece by piece because they are discrete issues. I think on the polarization side of things, this is actually press. Eli Pariser wrote a book called The Filter Bubble a number of years ago, actually many years ago, and people, I think, radically underestimated the negative impact that the capacity for personalization might have. It seemed like an unalloyed good. It was giving people the kind of content they wanted, but the reality is it has people self-sort into specific segments that end up becoming radicalized themselves. And I think that we can do a lot around that. I think that the basic principle here is the way you design technology is not neutral. Right? The way you design technology has material impact on the ultimate consequences of how people use that technology, what content they consume through that technology. And I think as technologists, we need to take responsibility for the ultimate consequences of what happens with the technology we design. And on polarization, there are many things you can do to disproportionately weight content and opportunities for engagement that bring people together as opposed to pull them apart.
Okay, great. So we've had we've had 2 minutes to talk about how terrible technology has been for democracy. If you guys have all voted, I would love to see the results of those. Could we put up what the room feels initially?
Wow, optimists.
Yeah.
We like optimists.
This is basically an example of self-sorting in action.
Of a stuffed ballot, actually.
Right. If you go out there, I think if we took this poll on a broad basis outside of the confines of website, we might see something very different. But it's good that people are optimistic. So why don't we talk about some of the things that technology can do to counteract self-sorting to start out with. You were mentioning that, to some extent, the degree to which a social media platform tends to sort people into different communities is determined by the algorithms of that platform itself, right?
Yeah. So when I think of this, I think about it in two different ways. So one of the existing technology platforms that are not designed for civic purposes, so just not designed for the purpose of advancing a better democracy. So like Facebook and Twitter, it's not that they're against those things, they're not specifically designed for that purpose. And one of the biggest challenges with that is when you're optimizing on people's user experience, you end up getting unexpected, unintended results, such as self-sorting and polarization. It is also the case that, Facebook in particular, the algorithm they write, like, it can be of any types of thing. You look at before the election in 2016 in America, one of the very striking things was that Facebook didn't take any into consideration the trustworthiness of the domain or the media source when they surface content. So it could be the BBC or The Economist, or it could be a recent news website created by Macedonian teenagers, and they wouldn't actually vary the relevance of the content based upon the source. And so you ended up getting a lot of misinformation and more extreme sensationalized content that was promoted. It's also the case that Facebook can easily track the extent to which content is only popular with a very narrow group of people, or if it's more broadly popular with a diverse group of people. And so if you write an algorithm that is optimized purely on clicks, purely on short-term engagement, you're going to get more polarization. And I think that Facebook recognizes this, and I hope takes that input into consideration deeply when they think about the future of their product, and the extent to which they can tweak algorithms to disproportionately advantage content that brings people together rather than divides them and pulls them apart. Mm-hmm. And we think about this in the same way. So that's a technology platform that's not designed for civic purposes, that's not about democracy, but has impact on democracy, because Facebook is effectively a public forum. It's a private company, but given the size and scale, it's effectively a public space. Now, you can also think of, well, what are the technologies we design specifically to combat polarization if we're designing for that purpose for democratic countries? And so this is one of the things we ask ourselves on a regular basis. How do you bring people together and build tools and products with the explicit intention of building social solidarity? And so one of the things we think about is when you mobilize people on social issues, you can either talk about, abstract issues in very impersonal ways, or you can talk about how those issues impact real people's lives. So change.org campaigns are oftentimes rooted in personal stories of individuals who are impacted by those issues. And by telling those stories, you end up actually getting a much greater degree of mobilization from a wider, diverse base of people, because stories build the kind of empathy and solidarity and connections that I think are necessary for a healthy democratic society.
Okay. So that's something that you can do to combat polarization and self-segregation, the building of filter bubbles. What's something that you can do to address the problem of fake news and the reliability of the information that's being spread? Yeah,
I think that the fake news, and these are the fake news situation is actually more addressable than the polarization information. I think right now, what the web has done very well, done very effectively, is work on how do you get trust and trust networks to be effective in directing behavior. So if you look at the biggest internet platforms, Google is maybe one of the best examples. So Google's PageRank is effectively based upon hyperlinks from websites to other websites as almost votes of trustworthiness. So they're using the hyperlinked nature of the internet to leverage that to determine what is the most trustworthy source of information for any given search. You use things like eBay was hugely important for peer-to-peer trust networks of random buyers and sellers. Airbnb, it's predicated upon there being trust in rankings. Uber, all these different platforms. And I think we have the same opportunity for content. I think we can actually leverage trust networks to be able to flag content or sources of content that are misinformation or fake news, and flag those to users, either remove them from platforms or simply surface the fact that that piece of content comes from a place that has been marked as misinformation or fake news in the past.
Mm-hmm. And there are a number of efforts to combat, to raise the degree of trust in online information that are based on inserting people into the equation. But as soon as you do that, you encounter tremendous hostilities in certain segments of the audience who assume that the people who are doing that are going to be biased in one direction or another, or who have an interest in delegitimizing that effort. Can you really do this as an algorithm-based process, or is this something that you have to insert people into the process to do?
Yeah, I think it has to be both. And in part, I think it's actually an algorithm that looks at, so one of the things Facebook has done and is looking at is looking at third parties, so third-party journalistic institutions that are nonprofits that are assessing and rating the veracity of information or source of information on the web, and then surfacing to readers or to consumers of content on Facebook if this piece of information or this source of content is trustworthy or not. And so it's effectively leveraging people who work for organizations in diverse places to be able to aggregate their preferences and their reporting and then surface that to users. I think what's important is it doesn't come from a single source. What Facebook's been trying to do is not just hire a lot of people to review content, which they're doing, but also if you get a diverse array enough of different sources that are assessing the veracity, the truthworthiness of different content and sources on Facebook, and then aggregate those, and also you rate how effective different third parties are at rating the truth of content over time, you end up actually balancing both things, and I think getting the best of both worlds. And this is what Wikipedia has done. Wikipedia is simultaneously using humans to rate the trustworthiness of content and of the effectiveness of other humans in curating Wikipedia. But if you're a person who's ineffectively misidentifying someone as not being trustworthy on a regular basis, then you yourself will not be considered trustworthy by the system. So I think there's really sophisticated ways for us to build interlocking sort of information sources that end up more effectively and more objectively identifying true and false information on the web.
Well, how do you do that with change.org campaigns? I mean, these are user-launched campaigns which build support from other users. Do you have to run through the claims that they're making as part of their campaigns to verify that they're accurate?
Yeah, so we use two-tier sources. So first of all, we let anybody mark any content as potentially offensive, bullying, inciting violence, or misinformation. And should that be marked by a critical mass of people as misinformation, we'll then go and review it in the same way you would as a journalistic entity. And so in some cases, we'll have to remove either content or the petition entirely if it is actually based on our assessment in the investigation, misinformation, or fake news.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So 2 years ago, I mean, we've been having this conversation for quite some time now. 2 years ago, after the 2016 elections in the US, you wrote an op-ed that called a lot of social media organizations to task and talked about what the technology community had to do in order to step up its game to stop hurting democracy. How much of that has been done?
It hasn't been zero, but it hasn't been enough. I mean, I would say that, and I'll just call it Facebook specifically because Facebook is the 800-pound gorilla. It is just the case that given raw traffic and distribution, Facebook is the most important political platform on the internet and in the world. And Facebook, I think, because of that, has the greatest potential for advancing good and the greatest potential for advancing ill in the world of almost any organization that exists. And that's a huge, I think, responsibility, but also opportunity for the company. And I think that the articulation that Zuckerberg has had about where they want to go, I think the company's making the right noises, has taken some steps, but it just seems like it hasn't been nearly as radical as would be necessary to effectively combat the problem. Right now, what it seems like the company is doing is trying to catch a lot of the falling pieces and mitigate the bad instead of actually re-look at what they're doing more fundamentally about how they can advance the good. So, for example, as far as I can see, there's a product currently, Facebook.com and the app, where the more people that use that product, the less informed they are about the world accurately, the less happy they are, and the more polarized they are. Like, that is not a healthy situation. That is a serious problem. And the way to fix that problem isn't to get more users. It's the opposite. Or to fundamentally shift the orientation of the organization in a way that is optimized around the kind of good that I think the company wants to make. If the company set as a specific goal that they wanted to make sure that the more people that use their product, the better accurate prediction they would have about like an understanding of the world, the better off they are in well-being, and the less polarized they are. Like, those would be, I think, extraordinary goals for the company to be able to set, and I actually believe they can execute against that. Now, like, the reality is, like, Facebook doesn't want all the things that have happened on its platform over the past couple of years. They'd rather not have it, and Facebook is not responsible for human nature, which is at the root of a lot of this. But they are responsible for designing tools that exploit human nature to create the kind of perverse outcomes that we've seen. And I think they have the greatest opportunity of any organization in the world to transform what they've done for the better.
Mm-hmm. If you look at the maps that I've seen of polarization on Facebook, where you see that people have extraordinarily few links to anyone among their friends who has different political opinions. It looks as if it's simply, at least in the United States, it's simply breaking down along two-party political lines. You mentioned earlier that some of the campaigns that Change.org runs manage to avoid that kind of partisan split, especially if they're concentrated on initiatives at the local level. You want to talk something about that?
Yeah, I think when we talk about politics, there's such an overwhelming orientation toward national political battles, and especially the most pitched, partisan, sort of polarizing battles. And the reality is, those are not the things that impact most people's lives most of the times. And most of the political orientation, decision-making, and consequences in most countries happens at the local level. And so what we end up seeing right now is that, it's 25,000 campaigns launched on Change.org each month. The majority of those are local campaigns, and actually a lot of them are corporate accountability campaigns as well, calling on companies like Facebook and others to be more responsible. And I think there's such an immense opportunity for not just increasing civic participation at a local level, which there is, but actually building bridges and solidarity and connections between people. When you look at issues around childcare or issues around environmental sustainability in your town. You look at things like better food for your kids. You look at things around homelessness in communities, around human trafficking. These are issues that actually bring people together in substantial ways. And because of the way the media is structured, there's a real perversity here where the media, because understandably most media companies are for-profits, sort of responding to whatever is the most provocative, sensationalized, and most likely to be clicked on. But the reality is, that doesn't represent the things that are actually what people care about necessarily. And so we see people on a regular basis. We look at the demographics of those who join local campaigns. They are in America Democrats and Republicans, progressives and conservatives. In Europe, but it cuts across all different political parties. And I think that we want to be able to invest more in those tools and more in opportunities to not just enable people to take deeper and more substantial local action, but in the process building greater connection to people in their community through that process. And that's, I think, a really big opportunity.
Yeah. So we've only got a couple of minutes here, but one of the most interesting and kind of depressing phenomena that we've seen over the last 4 to 5 years is that direct democracy tools like referendums, which were once seen as a positive tool of democratic engagement that can be empowered by technology, are now viewed with fear, particularly since the Brexit referendum. In the Netherlands, you had a technology-empowered referendum against the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, which forced the government to revise that entire agreement, and they're now scrapping the referendum law as a response. How can you convince governments that direct democracy empowered by technology is not something to run from, but something you actually have to work with?
Yeah, you've had this very odd sort of dynamic where on the one hand you have a traditional dynamic where elected officials and governments have been fairly asymmetric in just shoving information down the throats of citizens or making unilateral decisions and very infrequent input from citizens every 2 or 4 or 5 years for elections. And now you have almost this feeling of a shift where citizens can express their view at any point, at any time, and they're sort of steamrolling a lot of governments, and in some cases, direct democracy and referendum being examples of this. And we think one of the most effective, healthy things we can do is both more participatory democracies, but also more responsive democracies. And both those things are important. So participation from citizens giving input and feedback in real time, at any time, on any issue is, I think, healthy insofar as on the other side of the equation, there's elected officials and governments that are engaging and directly responding to citizens. So one of the things we are committed to and excited about is building that marketplace more and more over time, where I can walk outside on the street in my neighborhood at any point, pull out my phone, take action with 1,000 or 10 million people that also care about that same issue, be able to organize, talk about the issue, take deeper engagement, and then receive a response from my member of parliament or Congress or government within 7 days, directly on my phone, directly addressing that issue. I may disagree with them, I may feedback, but it's actually a two-way dialogue. Like the way the web once was thought to be potential for a healthy democracy, that is still possible. It is not easy. There's much downside right now that we've seen over the past 4 or 5 years in particular, but the possibility is still there, and it's up to us as technologists to invest the time and resources in building the kind of tools that will result in the kind of participatory and responsive democracy that we both need and deserve.
One of the things I really agree with in that is it's up to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.